Once you have completed the waxing of the 3-unit bridge and you have obtained all required occlusal contacts, verify that proper axial contour has been established as well. In particular on the ponic, it is critical that proper embrasure shape has been obtained and that the point contact typical of all mandibular posterior ponics has been obtained at the crest of the ridge. Axial contour should also have resulted in the proper occlusal configuration. The table of the ponic should be an approximate replica of the table on the contralateral side. It is permissible to reduce the width of the occlusal table of the ponic by as much as 1 millimeter, but no more. In order to relate the individual components of the bridge to one another prior to our soldering procedure, it is necessary to make a buccal index. This will be a plaster impression of the buccal contour that you have established in wax. To facilitate placement of the ponic back into the index, a little dot of wax will be positioned in the middle of the buccal surface. In order to prevent stone from running excessively around the dies and into the proximal embrasures, some Mortite is used to block these areas out. And then some rope Mortite is used to prevent the stone from flowing all the way over the cast. You'll have to press this onto the occlusal table and against the cervical portion of the cast, just enough that a little ledge is formed that will prevent the stone from running all the way down. It is imperative that the stone has a creamy consistency, again to prevent it from locking into the embrasures. If it is too runny, you will run the risk of having to redo the wax up. So be careful that you have the proper consistency of stone in order to make the index. The index, in order to be repositionable on the cast, must extend onto the adjacent teeth. It should not cover the occlusal surface, which should be free of stone. Here, slightly too much stone has run almost onto the occlusal aspect. After the stone has been allowed to fully set, the Mortite is removed and the index can be carefully removed by exerting some light pressure in a buccal direction. It is wise to support the occlusal table of the wax pattern by placing the thumb on it to reduce the chance of fracture of the pattern. The Mortite is then removed from the index and it is inspected for accuracy. The little dot should be clearly visible in the index, and an accurate impression of the contour of the buccal surface of the pontic, as well as the buccal surfaces of the two retainers and a small portion of the buccal surfaces of the molar and premolar, should have been reproduced in the index. The index is then tested to verify that it can be accurately repositioned on the cast. The index can be trimmed on a model trimmer or with a Bart Parker, and note that it can be easily repositioned and use the adjacent teeth as a reference point. Any any stone that is still present on the patterns must be carefully removed at this time so as not to result in problems during the casting phase. It is important that all stone is removed, but simultaneously that the actual contour is not substantially changed. A wax ribbon saw will be used to section the bridge into individual components. The saw is only slightly warmed in a Bunsen until it can be touched with the fingers. It should not be used very warm, but it should be slightly above room temperature. The ponic is supported with the fingers of the left hand, and a smooth, continuous cut is made through the connector that was flowed between the molar and the ponic. At this time, the die of the molar should be removable from the cast. The cross section of the connector should have a convex configuration on the tissue side. Simultaneously, it should allow for a solder joint of approximately 3.5 by 2.5 millimeters in size. The pattern is carefully removed from the die, which then must be relubricated prior to reflowing. The lubricant is allowed to dry off, and any excess can be removed with a small paper towel or a piece of toilet paper. The heavy Peter K. Thomas waxing instrument will be used to remelt the cervical 2 millimeters of the wax pattern. Proper adaptation in the marginal area is critical. The instrument is plunged into the pattern until it touches the stone die and moved all the way circumferentially around the pattern. Once again, it is imperative that the previous portion is remelted in any sequential plunging motion. It should be attempted not to destroy too much of the painstakingly established actual contour, but simultaneously it is more important to create marginal integrity because the actual contour usually can readily be re-established. Note that the wax now exhibits some concavities, such as here, because the wax has been readapted to the die. We will proceed now by adding additional wax in these areas to re-establish contour. This wax should extend slightly onto the die, cervical to the margin. This excess will then be carved away and our margination will be complete. Again, a trailing edge type motion is used to remove any excess wax. Care must be taken not to carve too much at this time, but rather use more of a burnishing motion. The objective is to obtain the most optimal adaptation of wax to the few millimeters immediately adjacent to the chamfer. Other than this type of a curved waxing instrument, you may wish to use the slightly warmed, but again not too warm, you don't want to melt the pattern, the slightly warmed heavy-ended waxing wire, and use a burnishing motion to adapt the wax properly to the die circumferentially. Once this has been obtained, it is critical that the pattern is invested within approximately 10 minutes to prevent relaxation of the wax to affect the marginal integrity of the finished restoration. Any small particles of wax that may be rubbed off can easily be removed by a non-abrasive finger. The pattern is now ready to be removed from the die and to be sprued for investing. A small amount of sticky wax is applied to the tip of the sprue former. This will reinforce the attachment of the sprue to the sprue former. Any excess, such as here, is removed while the wax is still soft. The sprue former should be clean and coated with a thin layer of Vaseline to make removal of the ring easier. The Vaseline ideally should not extend onto the sticky wax. A 10 gauge wax sprue will be used and will be placed at a slight angle on the mesiolingual cusp. A small piece of the sprue is cut off and the sprue is then slightly warmed over the Bunsen burner and positioned on the cusp. Adhesion will ordinarily keep this in place. At this time, additional wax is added where the sprue meets the pattern, and a nice flowing contour is established, which will enable the casting to be made without excessive turbulence or other casting problems as a result. The pattern is removed from the die after this wax has been allowed to set and will then be transferred to the sprue former. The same grip demonstrated earlier is used to remove the pattern, and the pattern really should not be tried back on the die because it's very easy to warp the margins. The pattern is held with tweezers by the sprue and placed in its proper position on the sprue former. It is then luted in place until it is solidly attached. By plunging the instrument slightly into the sticky wax, a solid bond is obtained. The wax is allowed to set and the tweezers can be withdrawn. Rough areas such as this are again filled with additional wax until a smooth, properly flowing extension of the cone is obtained. A ring lined with asbestos substitute is subsequently tried over the pattern, and it is verified that 1. The pattern is centered in the ring, and that the pattern is at least 6 millimeters from the open end of the pattern is coated with wax pattern cleaner, which will improve the wetting of the pattern by the investment through a reduction in surface energy. It is allowed to set, and immediately prior to investing, any excess will be blown off. The ring is submersed in water to moisten the asbestos substitute liner. The liner, however, should not be compressed. We are now ready to mix the investment and invest the pattern. Excess pattern cleaner is removed, and over light vibration the pattern is coated with investment. It is important to permit the investment to seek its own path, as otherwise bubbles may form. We prefer brush investing over vacuum investing, since it gives the operator slightly more control. If bubbles form, they can be easily poked at with the brush. The ring is then placed over the pattern on the sprue former, and vibration is used to fill the mold with investment. As the investment reaches the level of the pattern, the ring is tilted to allow the pattern to fill, and then the pouring process is continued. The investment, of course, has been mixed according to manufacturer's recommendations. The vibrator is shut off, and the ring is allowed to set for the specified period of time. A slightly larger size 8-gauge sprue is recommended to cast the ponic. Again, a 10-gauge can be used quite adequately for the 3/4 crown on the bicuspid. Sprue placement will vary depending on the size of the pattern. Ordinarily, the sprue is placed in the thickest portion of the wax pattern. The same procedure is repeated to sever the connector between the ponic and the bicuspid. This may be tricky because the angle of cutting should be in between the two patterns rather than that a portion of either is removed. It is recommended that the bicuspid is supported, and the ponic, which is a rather strong pattern because it is a solid bulk of wax, is simply allowed to fall off the model. Again, the cross-section is inspected for proper configuration with a convex cervical aspect of the connector to facilitate oral hygiene. These two patterns are then invested. The ponic, of course, does not need to be reflowed. The 3/4 crown, of course, does. Particular care must be taken to reflow the portions in the distobuccal groove in the modification area, the distal groove, as well as the mesial groove. Once the patterns have been invested, you're ready to proceed with the burnout and casting procedure. Once the investment has been allowed to set, you're ready to proceed with the burnout and casting procedure, which will be followed by carefully seating the castings on the individual dies. During the setting reaction of the investment, a skin will form in which you can see we have already scratched a B for bicuspid. It is important to be able to identify which pattern is contained in the ring. The skin is removed by carving with a plaster knife, making it flush with the top end of the ring, and the designation of the wax pattern is once again scratched in the investment. This will remind us how much gold we will need to cast the pattern. The sprue former can then be twisted off and should separate readily, and any loose particles are removed with the finger. Holding the ring inverted will prevent small particles from falling into the orifice of the sprue. A brush is used to remove any loose particles from the orifice. Any particles that may still remain are blown out with a blast of air. And again, the opening is inspected for any residual debris. Any particle undetected now can and likely will result in having to repeat the entire procedure. The ring is then placed in the burnout oven. The door is closed and the oven is turned on and set to the prescribed temperature, in this case approximately 900 degrees Fahrenheit.